Welcome back to Mildly Interesting and Sleepy. The night is here, and whatever you were doing before this moment is done for now. Let it rest. We have something good tonight, something that has all the satisfying qualities of a really well-made story. A visionary beginning, an improbable ascent, decades of extraordinary success, and then a fall that was so thoroughly foreseeable in retrospect, and so thoroughly unforeseen at the time, that it has become one of the most studied case studies in the history of business. Tonight, we are going into the story of Kodak. If you are of a certain age, the word Kodak produces an immediate and specific feeling, a warmth, a kind of nostalgic glow that is not entirely about photography. Kodak was not just a company that made cameras and film. For most of the 20th century, it was something closer to the custodian of memory itself, the company that made it possible for ordinary people to capture the moments of their lives and keep them. Birthdays, weddings, vacations, children growing up, old people in the last years before they died. All of it went through Kodak film into Kodak developing envelopes and came back as photographs that went into albums and boxes and shoeboxes under beds. The company was founded by a man of extraordinary vision and peculiar personality in the 1880s. It dominated its industry so completely for so long that the name Kodak became synonymous with photography the way Kleenex became synonymous with tissues. It employed tens of thousands of people in Rochester, New York, in a relationship so close that the city itself was shaped by the company's fortunes. And then, in a story that has been told many times, but that rewards one more careful telling, it failed. Not because the photography business collapsed, but because the world shifted to a different kind of photography, and Kodak, despite understanding that the shift was coming better than almost anyone, could not make itself move. The story of Kodak is a story about innovation and fear, about the difference between knowing what the future will look like and being able to actually live in it, about how the things that make a company great can become the things that prevent it from surviving. It is one of the great business tragedies of the 20th century, and it is genuinely interesting, and it will carry us comfortably into the night. Let us begin with the man. George Eastman, the driven man from Rochester. George Eastman was born in 1854 in Waterville, a small town in upstate New York, the youngest of 3 children. His father died when he was 7, leaving the family in difficult financial circumstances. His mother took in boarders to make ends meet. George left school at 14 to work as an office boy and taught himself accounting at night, moving through a series of office jobs with the focused determination of someone who understood early that his situation was not going to improve by itself. He was 23 years old when he first became interested in photography. He was planning a vacation to Santo Domingo, and a colleague suggested he photograph the trip. Photography in 1877 was not a casual hobby. It required a cumbersome and heavy set of equipment, a large camera, glass plate negatives that had to be coated with a chemical emulsion immediately before use, a portable darkroom for developing, and a collection of bottles and trays and chemicals. The wet plate collodion process, which was the standard technology of the time, required the photographer to prepare the plate in the darkroom, take the photograph immediately before the coating dried, and then develop the plate before it dried out completely. The entire process was time-sensitive, messy, and technically demanding. Eastman bought all the equipment, learned the process, and never ended up taking the vacation. But he was now fascinated by photography, and specifically by the question of whether it had to be this difficult. He began experimenting in his mother's kitchen at night after his day job, working on dry plate emulsions that would allow photographers to coat plates in advance rather than in the moment of use. This was not original research. in the sense of territory no one had explored. The dry plate process had been developed in England, and Eastman was reading about it in British photography journals. But he was systematic and patient and enormously persistent, and after 3 years of experimentation, he had developed a dry plate formula good enough to sell, and a machine for coating plates in quantity. In 1880, he patented his dry plate formula and began manufacturing plates in a rented loft in Rochester. In 1884, he introduced a paper-backed roll film, which eliminated the heavy glass plates entirely. In 1888, he introduced the first Kodak camera, a small box camera preloaded with enough film for 100 exposures, which could be sent back to the factory for developing and reloading. The camera cost $25, which was a significant sum in 1888, but what it offered was genuinely revolutionary: photography without the technical complexity. You pressed the button. Eastman's company did the rest. That phrase, "You press the button, we do the rest," was one of the most effective advertising slogans in the history of American business, and it announced the democratization of photography as clearly as anything could. Eastman was a man of tremendous energy and systematic intelligence, someone who combined genuine technical insight with a flair for marketing and a talent for organization that went beyond the skills of most inventors. He was also, in his personal life, somewhat austere and controlled, a bachelor throughout his life, close to his mother, maintaining strict habits of work and exercise, generous with money in calculated ways. He gave away enormous sums during his lifetime to education and public health, particularly in Rochester and in historically black colleges in the South. He was a paternalist employer in the tradition of the Gilded Age, genuinely concerned about his workers' welfare in a way that expressed itself as welfare capitalism rather than labor organizing, providing profit-sharing and benefits and recreational facilities. He was not an easy man, and people who worked closely with him found him demanding and sometimes cold. But he was also clearly brilliant, and the company he built reflected his qualities: systematic, technically excellent, market-focused, and organizationally disciplined. He died in 1932 at the age of 77 by his own hand. He left a note that said, simply, "My work is done. Why wait?" He had been in declining health and in pain. He had always been a man who organized his affairs carefully, and he organized the end of his life with the same deliberateness. The suicide was shocking to those who knew him, but not, perhaps, entirely surprising from a man who had always valued control above everything else. The Kodak moment, building an empire of memory. In the decades following the introduction of roll film and the first Kodak camera, George Eastman and the company he had built did something extraordinary. They expanded the market for photography almost from scratch. This is different from and harder than winning market share in an existing industry. They had to convince people who had never thought of themselves as photographers that photography was something they should do, could do, wanted to do. They had to make it affordable, make it simple, make it culturally normative. The introduction of the Brownie camera in 1900 was the moment this democratization fully arrived. The Brownie was designed to be used by children. It was named after the popular cartoon characters of the era and marketed directly to young people as a camera they could operate themselves. It cost $1. Film for it cost 15 cents a roll. For the first time, photography was genuinely within reach of almost any family in America, not as an occasional formal studio portrait, but as a daily domestic practice, something you did at birthday parties and on vacation and in the backyard on Sunday afternoons. The Brownie created the snapshot. Before the Brownie, photographs were formal affairs, carefully staged, taken by professionals or by serious amateurs with complicated equipment. After the Brownie, photographs were casual, spontaneous, personal. They were pictures of people being themselves rather than performing for the camera. The visual vocabulary of the 20th century, the informal family photograph, the vacation snapshot, the candid portrait, all of this flowed from the Brownie and from Eastman's decision to make photography ordinary. Eastman Kodak, as the company was formerly known, also understood early that film was the real business, not cameras. Cameras were what you sold once. Film was what you sold forever, every time the customer took a picture, every time they needed to capture another moment of their life. This insight that the durable good was less important than the consumable, that the razor was less profitable than the blades, was central to Kodak's business model from the beginning. The company invested in manufacturing film at scale, in controlling the chemistry and the process with extraordinary precision, and in building a distribution network that put Kodak film wherever a camera might be used. By the middle of the 20th century, Kodak was one of the most valuable companies in America. It had somewhere between 80 and 90% of the film market in the United States, an almost unimaginable monopoly position in a consumer product used by nearly every household. It was the fifth most valuable brand in the world in the 1990s. Rochester, New York, was essentially a company town. Kodak employed more than 60,000 people there at its peak, and the economic life of the region was so thoroughly organized around the company that Kodak was sometimes referred to by locals as the Great Yellow Father, an ironic but affectionate nickname for an employer who had been the center of economic and social life for generations. The cultural footprint of Kodak extended far beyond its market position. The Kodak moment became a phrase in the English language, used to describe any significant emotional moment worth capturing and preserving. Kodak was the sponsor of the photo booths at Disneyland, the film in the cameras of Life magazine photojournalists, the emulsion on the film stock used by Hollywood directors. The color palette of mid-century American photography, the warm, saturated tones of Kodachrome, the vivid blues and greens of Ektachrome, was Kodak's color palette, and it has become the visual signature of an era, the color of memory for anyone who grew up in the 20th century. Kodachrome, the film that became a song. Among all the products Kodak produced over its century of dominance, none achieved the cultural status of Kodachrome, the color transparency film introduced in 1935. Kodachrome was not the first color film, but it was the first to produce results beautiful enough to be genuinely useful for professional photography. And over the decades, it became something like the gold standard for color rendition, the film that professional photographers and serious amateurs reached for when they needed colors that were accurate and rich and lasting. Paul Simon wrote a song about it in 1973. The song is not really about film. It is about nostalgia and youth and the tendency of memory to make the past look better than it was. But the choice of Kodachrome as the central metaphor tells you something about what the film meant. It was synonymous with the warm, saturated, idealized way that memory presents the past to us. Kodachrome gives us those nice, bright colors, Simon sang. It makes you think all the world's a sunny day. The film and the feeling were the same thing. Kodachrome was also a remarkable technical achievement that Kodak maintained through a proprietary process for decades. The film used a die-coupled color development process that was so complex and required such precise chemical control that Kodak processed virtually all of it at its own laboratories, through a network of processing facilities that were maintained to extraordinary standards. This meant that shooting Kodachrome required sending your film to Kodak. You could not develop it yourself or have it done at a local lab. This was a deliberate design choice that kept the processing revenue inside Kodak and maintained quality control. But it also meant that Kodachrome's fate was tied to Kodak's ability and willingness to operate those processing facilities. Kodachrome was discontinued in 2009, one of the early casualties of the digital transition. The last roll of Kodachrome was processed in 2010 at Duane's Photo in Parsons, Kansas, the last lab in the world still equipped to handle it. The news that Kodachrome was ending was treated by photographers and film enthusiasts as something close to a cultural bereavement. People drove hundreds of miles to buy the last rolls. The final processing ceremony at Duane's was attended by photographers from around the world. Steve McCurry, the photographer who took the famous image of the Afghan girl for National Geographic, was given the last roll to shoot. The death of Kodachrome was the visible symbol of a much larger change, the end of an era not just in photography, but in how human beings related to the images of their own lives. But before we get to the fall, we need to spend time in the middle period, the decades of extraordinary success, because without understanding what Kodak was at its peak, the story of its decline does not make complete sense. The business of memory, how Kodak actually worked. Kodak's business model in its heyday was so good, so structurally advantaged, that it is worth describing in some detail, because the structural advantages were also, in the end, the structural vulnerabilities. The basic architecture was this. Kodak made money in three connected ways. It sold cameras, which put film-using devices in consumers' hands. It sold film, which those devices consumed in enormous quantities every time someone took a picture. And it provided developing and printing services, either directly through its own labs or through the network of photo finishing shops that used Kodak chemistry and paper and equipment. Every link in the chain was Kodak. You bought a Kodak camera, loaded it with Kodak film, sent the film to be developed with Kodak chemicals on Kodak paper, and picked up Kodak prints. The vertical integration was essentially complete. This architecture produced a flywheel effect that was almost impossible for competitors to disrupt. Once consumers were in the Kodak ecosystem, they stayed there because every part of the system was optimized for every other part. Using Fujifilm in a Kodak camera worked technically, but produced results that most consumers perceived as slightly different, and the slight difference was enough to keep them loyal. More importantly, the distribution network, the presence of Kodak film in every drugstore and supermarket and airport gift shop, made Kodak the default choice even for consumers who had no strong preferences. You bought what was there. The margins on film were extraordinary. Film was a consumable product with significant technical barriers to entry, and Kodak had been operating at scale for so long that its manufacturing costs were far below what any new competitor could achieve. The chemicals and the coating technology and the quality control systems represented decades of accumulated expertise that could not be quickly replicated. When Fujifilm entered the American market aggressively in the 1980s, partly through the visibility of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, where Fuji was the official film sponsor after outbidding Kodak, it caused significant disruption to Kodak's market share. But even Fuji, a company with deep photographic expertise and strong financial resources, could not dislodge Kodak from its dominant position quickly. The competitive moat was real and deep. The film business also benefited from a structural tailwind that was not of Kodak's making, but that Kodak rode expertly: the baby boom. The post-World War II baby boom produced a generation of young families who were exactly the target market for amateur photography. Young parents documenting their children's lives, families going on the first vacation trips made possible by the new interstate highway system, people capturing the prosperity and optimism of the post-war years. All of this drove film sales in quantities that Kodak's founders could not have imagined. When this generation's children grew up and started their own families in the 1970s and 1980s, the cycle repeated. By the early 1990s, Kodak was generating revenues of around $10 billion a year and profits that were, by almost any measure, extraordinary. The film business specifically was operating at profit margins that some analysts estimated at between 60 and 70%. 60 to 70% operating margins on a consumer product. In the history of American industry, very few businesses have achieved that kind of structural profitability, and fewer still have sustained it for as long as Kodak did. The invention that changed everything. Kodak invents digital photography. In 1975, a 24-year-old Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson built a device that would eventually destroy the company he worked for. It was a prototype digital camera, a device that captured images electronically and stored them on a cassette tape rather than on film. It weighed about 8 pounds. It took 23 seconds to capture an image and another 23 seconds to play it back on a television screen. The image resolution was 0.01 megapixels, a number that would become laughably low within a few decades, but that was, in 1975, a proof of concept rather than a practical product. Sasson demonstrated the prototype to Kodak executives. Their response, as he later described it, was not hostile but was deeply cautious. The technology was interesting, they acknowledged, but it had obvious problems. The image quality was far below what film could achieve. The storage and playback mechanisms were clunky, and more fundamentally, the digital camera would, if it ever became practical and affordable, eliminate the need for film entirely. Why would Kodak develop a technology that would cannibalize its most profitable business? This response was not irrational. It was, in fact, a completely logical assessment of the situation from the perspective of a company whose profits depended on film. A digital camera that worked well enough would make film obsolete. Kodak's 60 to 70% margins on film would disappear. The carefully constructed ecosystem of cameras and film and developing would be disrupted at its core. The rational short-term calculation was to be cautious about digital photography, to protect the existing business, to allow the technology to develop slowly and manage the transition carefully. The problem with this rational calculation was that it was rational only in the short term. In the medium and long term, the question was not whether digital photography would eventually produce image quality comparable to film, but when. And the answer, driven by the relentless progress of semiconductor technology and the equally relentless decline in the cost of digital storage, was sooner than anyone at Kodak was willing to believe. Kodak did continue working on digital photography after Sasson's prototype. The company was not passive or oblivious. It developed digital cameras. It developed digital imaging software. It developed products for the professional photography market and the medical imaging market, where digital had clear advantages. It spent billions of dollars on digital research and development through the 1980s and 1990s. It was not a company that ignored the future. It was a company that understood the future clearly and could not bring itself to embrace it fully, because embracing it fully would require dismantling the present. Steve Sasson has told this story many times in the years since, and he describes the Kodak culture with a precision that is not unkind, but is completely clear-eyed. The people at Kodak were smart, he says. They understood what was coming. They just could not figure out how to get there from where they were without destroying everything they had built. This is the tragedy of Kodak, stated in its simplest form. They saw it coming. They just could not move. The Fuji problem. Competition arrives. While Kodak was managing its relationship with the digital future, a more immediate threat was arriving from Japan. Fuji Photo Film Company had been founded in 1934 and had developed into a major photographic film manufacturer in Japan and Asia. Through the 1960s and 1970s, it had been a presence in international markets, but had not significantly challenged Kodak's dominance in the United States, which was the world's largest and most profitable photography market. That began to change in the 1980s. Fuji made a strategic decision to compete aggressively in the American market, and it did so with a combination of price and quality that Kodak found genuinely difficult to respond to. Fuji film was priced significantly below Kodak film and was, by most independent assessments, of comparable or nearly comparable quality. For amateur photographers who were not deeply invested in the specific aesthetic of Kodak film, the price difference was persuasive. The 1984 Los Angeles Olympics was a turning point. Kodak had been the official film of the Olympics for decades. It was a sponsorship that felt so natural, so thoroughly aligned with what Kodak was, that the company had perhaps come to take it for granted. When Fuji offered the Olympic Organizing Committee a sponsorship deal that Kodak declined to match, Fuji got the contract. The images of the 1984 Olympics, one of the most photographically documented events in history, went through Fuji cameras and onto Fuji film. The visibility was enormous, and the message it sent was clear. There was another film, and it was good enough. Kodak responded to Fuji's competitive challenge in several ways, some effective and some not. It improved its own film quality and its pricing. It invested in marketing. It developed new products. But it was operating with the disadvantage of a company that is defending a position rather than attacking one, and the structural costs of its enormous domestic operation, the 60,000 employees in Rochester, the manufacturing facilities, the research laboratories, the pension obligations, all of this made it difficult to match the cost structure of a competitor who did not carry the same legacy weight. The Fuji competition was, in retrospect, the warning sign that Kodak was not as invulnerable as it appeared. A competitor with a credible product at a lower price had managed to take a meaningful share of the American film market, something that had seemed impossible a decade earlier. If a competitor using the same basic technology could do that, what would happen when a competitor using a fundamentally different technology arrived? The 1990s, the decade of denial and attempt. The 1990s were the decade in which Kodak's fate was essentially decided, though the consequences did not fully manifest until the following decade. The choices made, the strategies adopted and abandoned, the reorganizations attempted, and the opportunities missed. All of it happened in the 1990s, and the result was a company that entered the 21st century in a structurally weakened position from which it would never fully recover. In 1989, Kodak introduced the photo CD, a system that allowed consumers to have their photographs digitized onto a compact disc when they brought their film in for developing. This was a genuine attempt to bridge the analog and digital worlds, to give consumers the convenience of digital images while preserving the film-based workflow that kept Kodak's business running. The photo CD was technologically impressive and reasonably well designed, but it was positioned in a way that made it more useful for professionals and enthusiasts than for the mass consumer market, and it never achieved the scale that would have allowed it to transform Kodak's position. In 1994, Kodak introduced the Advantix camera system, also known as APS, for Advanced Photo System. This was a new film format, smaller than the standard 35mm, with some digital features built in, including the ability to select different print sizes and a magnetic strip on the film that recorded exposure data. The Advantix system was developed jointly by Kodak, Fuji, Canon, Minolta, and Nikon, an unusual industry collaboration designed to create a new standard. It was a classic innovator's attempt to improve on the existing technology while staying within the existing paradigm. It was reasonably successful by the standards of a new film format launch. But by the time it launched, the digital camera market was already beginning to develop in earnest, and APS was, in retrospect, an investment in a technology that was already becoming obsolete before it was fully deployed. The company went through a series of leadership changes in the 1990s that reflected its strategic confusion. Kay Whitmore, who became CEO in 1989, was an engineer from the film division who believed deeply in film's future and was reluctant to commit fully to digital. He was replaced in 1993 by George Fisher, who was recruited from Motorola with the explicit mandate to lead Kodak's digital transformation. Fisher understood technology, understood the direction of the industry, and made significant changes. He divested Kodak's pharmaceutical and household products businesses, which Eastman Kodak had acquired in an earlier diversification strategy, and refocused the company on imaging. He invested in digital products and infrastructure. He made the right strategic calls on many individual decisions. And yet Kodak's digital transformation stalled under Fisher too, for reasons that were partly strategic and partly structural. The film business was still generating enormous profits in the mid-1990s, and those profits created a gravitational pull that kept resources flowing toward the existing business rather than toward the uncertain future. Every dollar invested in digital was a dollar not invested in film, and film was still producing the kind of returns that made the investment case for digital genuinely difficult to make with a straight face in the short term. The tyranny of the current quarter's earnings was real and powerful, and it systematically disadvantaged the long-term investment that digital transformation required. The other problem was cultural. Kodak had been built around the chemistry of film, around the knowledge of emulsions and coatings and sensitization and color rendering. The people who had built the company and who ran it were people who understood film deeply and loved it with a professional's love, the love of someone who has devoted their career to mastering something and who has watched it produce extraordinary results. Asking these people to abandon film for digital was not just a business decision. It was asking them to accept that the thing they were expert in was becoming worthless, that the knowledge they had accumulated over decades would no longer be relevant. This is a deeply human difficulty, and it operated throughout the Kodak organization in ways that no strategic plan could fully overcome. The digital camera arrives. The world changes faster than expected. The first consumer digital cameras appeared in the early 1990s. The Apple QuickTake, one of the first mass-market digital cameras, was introduced in 1994. It was large and expensive and produced images of limited quality, and it was not a serious threat to film photography for most users. But the trajectory of improvement was rapid, following the general pattern of digital technology. The capabilities doubled approximately every 2 years, while the prices fell dramatically. By the late 1990s, digital cameras were becoming genuinely capable at price points that serious amateur photographers could afford. By 2000, digital cameras were selling in significant numbers. By 2003, digital camera sales in the United States surpassed film camera sales for the first time. The crossover had happened faster than most analysts had predicted and far faster than Kodak had planned for. Kodak was not absent from the digital camera market. It made digital cameras. It had been making them since the early 1990s. At various points in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was actually among the leading sellers of digital cameras in the United States. But digital cameras were a fundamentally different business from the film business that had made Kodak great. The margins were much lower, competitive pressure was intense, and most importantly, there was no film to sell. A consumer who bought a digital camera and then filled a memory card with photographs was not generating any ongoing revenue for Kodak after the initial purchase. The razor blade model, which had been the economic engine of Kodak's success for a century, simply did not apply in the digital world. Kodak tried to find the equivalent of film blades in the digital world. It pushed aggressively into inkjet printing, reasoning that people would still want physical prints of their digital photographs, and that if Kodak could capture the printing consumables business, the ink and the paper, it could recreate something like the film and developing revenue stream. This was not an unreasonable strategy. People did want prints, especially of significant photographs. And for a time, it seemed like the printing strategy might work, and Kodak invested billions of dollars in developing inkjet printers and ink systems. The problem was that the market did not behave as expected. People's relationship with photographs changed fundamentally in the digital age. The physical print, which had been the natural endpoint of every photographic process for a century, became an optional extra rather than the default. People took far more photographs than they ever had with film because digital photographs cost nothing marginal to take. But they printed far fewer of them because the photographs lived on computers and phones and eventually in the cloud, viewable on screens, shareable by email, and then by social media. The desire for physical prints never went away, but it became selective rather than universal, reserved for the most significant images rather than applied to every roll of film. Rochester, what happens to a company town? To understand the full weight of Kodak's decline, you have to understand what it meant to Rochester, New York. Rochester is a medium-sized city on the south shore of Lake Ontario, in the snowbelt of western New York, and for most of the 20th century, it was one of the more prosperous and stable mid-sized American cities, largely because of Kodak. Kodak, at its peak, employed more than 60,000 people in the Rochester area, in a metropolitan area of less than 1 million people. This meant that nearly every family in the region had some direct or indirect connection to Kodak, someone who worked there, or whose spouse worked there, or whose parents had worked there. The company's payroll, its pension obligations, its purchases from local suppliers, its charitable contributions, its investment in parks and cultural institutions. All of this was woven into the fabric of the city in a way that made Kodak and Rochester functionally inseparable. Kodak was paternalistic in the Gilded Age tradition that George Eastman had established. It offered excellent wages and benefits, profit-sharing that in good years could add significantly to workers' incomes, medical care, recreational facilities, educational support. The deal was implicit but clear. Kodak would provide security and stability and comfort, and in return, its employees would be loyal and diligent, and would understand that their individual interests were aligned with the company's. This deal worked for decades, and it created a culture in which Kodak's continued success seemed so natural, so guaranteed, that it was almost impossible to imagine the alternative. When the decline came, it came in stages that the city experienced as a slow-motion disaster. The layoffs began in the late 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s and into the 2000s. The workforce that had been over 60,000 in the 1980s fell to 30,000 in the mid-1990s, to to 15,000 by the mid-2000s, to fewer than 8,000 by the time Kodak filed for bankruptcy in 2012. Each round of layoffs rippled through the local economy. Fewer Kodak workers meant fewer customers for local businesses, fewer mortgage holders, fewer people contributing to the local tax base, fewer supporters of local charities and cultural institutions. Rochester has not recovered in the way that some other post-industrial cities have, and the Kodak legacy is part of the reason. The company's dominance for so long meant that a generation of the most talented people in the region built their careers at Kodak rather than starting their own businesses. The ecosystem of small and medium-sized technology companies that might have emerged in a different environment simply did not develop, because Kodak absorbed so much of the available talent and capital. When Kodak collapsed, there was less of a local technology ecosystem to catch the workers it released than there might have been in a city that had never had a single dominant employer. The story of Rochester and Kodak is the story of a company town in the most literal sense, and it is a story that has been repeated across American industrial history in different industries and different cities, but rarely with quite the same completeness, the same totality of dependence and subsequent collapse. The bankruptcy, 2012. Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on January 19, 2012. The filing was, by the time it happened, not a surprise to anyone who had been following the company. The stock price had been in decline for years. The consumer film business had essentially ceased to exist as a significant revenue source. The digital camera business had never generated the margins that would allow it to replace film. The printing strategy had not performed as hoped. The company was burning through cash to sustain operations and meet its pension obligations, and it had been borrowing against its patent portfolio to keep the lights on. The patent portfolio was, in fact, one of the last significant assets Kodak possessed, and it was a substantial one. Kodak had been generating patents for more than a century, and its imaging patents, particularly its patents related to digital imaging technology, were potentially very valuable. In the years leading up to bankruptcy, Kodak had been attempting to monetize these patents through licensing and through litigation, suing smartphone manufacturers including Apple and HTC for infringing on digital imaging patents. The irony was almost too neat. Kodak, the company that had invented digital photography and then failed to capitalize on it, was now trying to survive by suing the companies that had successfully commercialized the technology that Kodak had pioneered. The lawsuits produced some settlements and some licensing revenue, but not enough to address the fundamental structural problems. The bankruptcy process lasted about 19 months. Kodak sold most of its significant patent portfolio for approximately $525 million, a sum that represented only a fraction of the value that the same patents might have commanded in a stronger negotiating position. The consumer photography business, which had been Kodak's core for more than a century, was wound down. The company that emerged from bankruptcy in September 2013 was a much smaller entity focused on commercial printing, packaging, and related technologies for business customers rather than consumers. It was, in a real sense, no longer the company that had defined photography for the 20th century. Human cost of the bankruptcy was significant. The pension fund for retired Kodak workers, one of the largest in the country, faced cuts. Workers who had spent their careers at Kodak in the expectation of a secure retirement found their retirement security reduced. The social contract that Eastman had established, the implicit promise that the company would take care of its people, was broken not by malice, but by the simple arithmetic of a business that could no longer afford its obligations. Why it happened. The innovator's dilemma in perfect form. The story of Kodak's failure has been analyzed extensively in business schools and management literature, and the most influential framework for understanding it comes from the work of Clayton Christensen, whose book, The Innovator's Dilemma, published in 1997, uses Kodak, among other examples, to illustrate a pattern that recurs throughout business history. Christensen's argument is that successful companies fail not because they are stupid or lazy or badly managed, but because they are rational. They listen to their best customers who want improvements to the existing products. They invest in the technologies that will produce the highest returns within their existing business model. They make decisions that optimize for the current situation. And all of these rational decisions, taken together, lead them to miss the disruptive technology that arrives from below, initially inferior on the dimensions that current customers care about, but superior on different dimensions that turn out to matter more to future customers. Digital photography in its early years was inferior to film on the dimensions that Kodak's existing customers cared about. Image quality, cost, convenience in the sense that you did not need a computer to view your photographs. It was superior on dimensions that would eventually matter more. No cost per shot, immediate viewing, easy sharing, no physical storage required. Kodak's customers in the 1980s and early 1990s did not want digital cameras. They wanted better film, cheaper film, faster developing. Kodak listened to its customers and gave them what they asked for, and in doing so, it rationally walked itself toward the cliff. The specific version of this pattern that Kodak experienced was particularly acute because of the profitability of its existing business. The 60 to 70% margins on film were not just a success metric, they were a trap. Any digital product Kodak introduced would, by definition, cannibalize some of that margin. A digital camera that replaced a film camera reduced film sales. A successful digital printing business might eventually replace film developing. Every step toward the digital future was a step away from the extraordinary profitability of the existing business, and every such step had to be justified in the face of the existing business's continuing ability to generate extraordinary returns. The more successful the film business was, the harder it was to justify the investments that would have allowed Kodak to transition. There is also a cultural dimension that Christensen's framework does not fully capture. Kodak was not just a film company in the organizational sense. It was a film company in a deeper cultural and emotional sense. The people who worked there had built their careers, their identities, their sense of professional competence around the chemistry and physics and art of silver halide photography. Digital photography was not just a different technology. It was a different way of being in the world, a world in which the accumulated expertise of Kodak's workforce was not the most important thing. The resistance to digital within Kodak was not merely political or financial. It was the resistance of people who loved what they did and who did not want to accept that what they loved was becoming irrelevant. What Kodak got right, the innovations that mattered. In the years since Kodak's bankruptcy, there has been a tendency to tell the story purely as a story of failure, of a company that could not adapt. This is fair as far as it goes, but it leaves out the remarkable record of genuine innovation that Kodak produced across its long history. The failure at the end does not negate the achievements that preceded it, and understanding those achievements is part of understanding what was actually lost. Kodak's contributions to photography were foundational and far-reaching. The development of flexible roll film in the 1880s made the modern camera possible. Without it, photography would have remained a cumbersome practice, requiring heavy equipment and technical expertise. The Brownie camera democratized photography and created the snapshot culture that defined visual self-documentation in the 20th century. Kodachrome and Ektachrome brought color photography to professional and amateur markets with a quality and permanence that had not previously existed. The amateur 8 and Super 8 film formats made home movies possible for the family market. The disc camera of the 1980s, though less successful commercially than its predecessors, was a genuine engineering achievement in miniaturization. In the professional and scientific domains, Kodak's contributions were equally significant. Kodak film was used in the Apollo space program with specially developed emulsions for the specific challenges of space photography. Kodak developed the film used in reconnaissance satellites during the Cold War, a program so classified that its existence was not publicly acknowledged for decades. Kodak's involvement in medical X-ray film technology improved diagnostic medicine for most of the 20th century. The company's research laboratories, particularly the research facility in Rochester, produced significant advances in photochemistry, optical physics, and related fields. And in digital imaging, Kodak's contributions were earlier and more substantial than its ultimate failure would suggest. Beyond Steve Sassen's 1975 prototype, Kodak developed the first megapixel sensor in 1986, ahead of any competitor. It developed the photo CD system in 1989, which was a genuine attempt to create a bridge between analog and digital photography that was technically successful even if it was commercially limited. Its digital camera products in the 1990s and early 2000s were competitive with the best available. The failure was not a failure of technical capability. It was a failure of organizational will and business model adaptation. The tragedy is precisely that Kodak had the technical capability, the financial resources, the brand recognition, and the customer relationships that should have allowed it to lead the digital transition rather than being destroyed by it. Apple had none of these advantages when it entered the music industry with the iPod, yet it created the platform that transformed music distribution. Kodak had all the advantages and still could not make the leap. The gap between capability and execution was never more consequential. The competitors who won, what they did differently. To understand Kodak's failure more clearly, it helps to look at the companies that successfully navigated the same transition or that won the markets Kodak seeded. Fujifilm is the most instructive comparison because Fuji faced exactly the same challenge that Kodak did. Fuji was also a film company whose business was built on silver halide photography. Fuji also saw its core market being eliminated by digital technology, and Fuji survived. It did not survive by being better at digital cameras than Kodak. Fuji's digital camera business is not a dominant one. It survived by taking the chemical and material science expertise it had developed for film and applying it to entirely different markets. Fuji's photographic chemistry knowledge transferred to LCD optical films, to pharmaceutical compounds, to cosmetics, and to office equipment. Fuji diversified deliberately and systematically into adjacent industries where its technical expertise was relevant, and it built new businesses before the old one collapsed entirely. Kodak attempted some of this diversification, including the pharmaceutical and household products businesses that George Fisher sold off in the 1990s, but it did not do so with Fuji's success, and the businesses it entered were not as closely connected to its core technical competencies. The lesson that Fuji's survival offers is not that diversification is always the answer, but that diversification into areas where your existing capabilities are genuinely relevant can be a form of survival that pure focus on the declining core business cannot achieve. Canon and Nikon navigated the transition differently, from the perspective of camera manufacturers rather than film companies. Both companies made the transition from film cameras to digital cameras successfully, though it required enormous investment and significant disruption to their existing product lines. The key difference between their situation and Kodak's was that camera manufacturers did not have a film business to protect. When film cameras became obsolete, Canon and Nikon lost their existing camera business, but they did not lose a high-margin consumable business that digital would eliminate. They could embrace digital cameras fully without cannibalizing their most profitable revenue stream, because their most profitable revenue stream was already cameras rather than film. The companies that created the platforms that truly replaced Kodak's role in the photography ecosystem were Apple, Google, and Facebook, none of which were photography companies. The iPhone camera became the most used camera in the world, not because it was the best camera technically, but because it was always with you, and its photographs went directly into a sharing ecosystem that made them instantly social. Instagram, acquired by Facebook in 2012 for $1 billion, understood that photography in the smartphone era was a social activity, not a memory preservation activity, and built a platform organized around that insight. The Kodak moment had been replaced by the Instagram post, and the company that owned the Kodak moment had no role in the transition. The lessons, what business schools say and what they miss. Kodak has become one of the most analyzed cases in the history of business education, and the lessons drawn from it are numerous and not always consistent. The most common version of the Kodak lesson is a warning about the dangers of ignoring disruptive technology, of being so committed to the existing business model that you cannot adapt to a new one. This lesson is true and useful, but somewhat incomplete. The more uncomfortable lesson, the one that is harder to apply, is about the relationship between success and vulnerability. Kodak's failure was not caused by weakness, it was caused by strength. The very things that made Kodak great, the quality of its film, the depth of its distribution, the loyalty of its customers, the profitability of its business model, the expertise of its workforce, were the things that made it impossible to move quickly when the world changed. The skills and the culture and the business model that are optimized for one environment are not transferable without significant pain to a fundamentally different environment. There is also a lesson about the limits of strategic clarity. Kodak's leaders understood what was happening. They knew digital photography was coming. They knew it would disrupt their business. They wrote memos and held meetings and developed strategies and produced products. The problem was not lack of knowledge. The problem was that the organizational machinery of a large, successful company is not designed to act on knowledge that contradicts the current source of revenue. The gravitational field of existing success is very strong, and overcoming it requires not just strategic insight, but organizational courage and willingness to accept short-term pain for long-term survival. These qualities are genuinely rare in large organizations, and Kodak, for all its strengths, could not produce them when it needed them most. The lesson for individuals, if there is one, is perhaps more personal and more applicable than the lesson for organizations. We are all, in some sense, in Kodak's position. Our expertise and our experience and our identity are built around the things we have done, the technologies we have mastered, the ways of working that have made us successful. The world changes, and what was expertise becomes obsolete, and the question is whether we can let go of the thing we are good at in order to become good at something new. This is hard. It is hard for companies, and it is hard for people. Kodak's story suggests that knowing it is necessary is not the same as being able to do it. Kodak after Kodak, what remains? The Kodak that emerged from bankruptcy in 2013 is a real company that continues to operate, but it is a company in a different business, serving different customers than the Kodak that shaped the 20th century. The post-bankruptcy Kodak is primarily a commercial printing and packaging company, serving business customers with digital printing technology, printing plates, and related products. It is not a consumer company. It does not sell to families documenting their lives. It is not the custodian of memory. The Kodak brand retains value in certain contexts, particularly in emerging markets where the name still carries associations of photographic quality and heritage. Various licensing deals have put the Kodak name on smartphones and other consumer electronics products in markets including China and Southeast Asia. These products have no connection to the company's core historical expertise. They are licensing plays, the brand name being rented to products that benefit from the warm associations it still carries. The physical plant of Kodak's Rochester operations has been partially repurposed into a technology hub that has attracted smaller companies in fields including optics, imaging, and advanced manufacturing. The irony of Kodak's Rochester facilities becoming a home for the kinds of startup technology companies that Kodak could not itself become is not lost on observers of the local economy. The buildings and the equipment and some of the expertise remain. The organization that housed them is gone. Kodachrome, the film that Paul Simon sang about, is genuinely gone. It cannot be made again, even if someone wanted to make it, because the chemicals required for its development process are no longer produced commercially, and some of them may no longer be manufactured at all. The last processing lab closed, the equipment was dismantled, and the knowledge required to operate it is no longer held in active form by any institution. This is the kind of loss that is genuinely irreversible, the loss of a technology that was not replaced by something equivalent, but was replaced by something different, something that does many things better and some things not quite the same. The photographs themselves remain. The billions of photographs taken on Kodak film over more than a century, the birthdays and weddings and vacations and ordinary Sundays, are still in their boxes and albums and shoeboxes under beds. They are yellowing slowly, the way photographs do. Some have been digitized and will last indefinitely. Many have not, and when the people who remember who is in them are gone, the photographs will become archaeology rather than memory. This is the fate of all photographs, and it was always the fate of all photographs, and Kodak understood this as well as anyone. That is why they sold the film, to capture the moment before it was gone. The moments are still there, on the paper and the emulsion, fading slowly toward the light. The Kodak moment, reconsidered. We use the phrase Kodak moment to describe a moment worth capturing, a moment of emotional significance that deserves to be preserved. The phrase has outlasted the company's relevance as a photographic brand. People still say Kodak moment, even though they are taking photographs on iPhones and sharing them on Instagram. The phrase has become detached from its origin and now means simply, "This is important. I want to remember this. This is the kind of thing that should be documented." There is something appropriate about this linguistic survival. Kodak was, above everything else, the company that convinced the world that ordinary moments were worth capturing. Before Kodak, before the Brownie camera, before the democratization of photography, the visual record of most people's lives was sparse. Formal portraits existed, taken on special occasions. But the texture of daily life, the birthday party, the Sunday picnic, the child learning to walk, the grandmother in her garden, this was not recorded, not preserved, not passed down. Kodak made it possible to record these things, and once it was possible, it became normal, and once it was normal, it became essential. We live now in an age of photographic abundance, so extreme that it has created its own problems. More photographs are taken every 2 minutes today than were taken in the entire 19th century. The average smartphone user takes hundreds of photographs a year, most of which are never looked at again. The Kodak moment has been replaced by the compulsive documentation of everything, the reflexive reaching for the phone camera that has become as automatic as breathing. Whether this is better or worse than the relative scarcity of photographs in the Kodak era is a question that does not have a clear answer. But it is unambiguously different, and the difference begins with George Eastman deciding in 1888 that photography should be easy enough for anyone, that you press the button and someone else does the rest. The rest, eventually, was done by algorithms rather than chemists, by silicon rather than silver halide, by the cloud rather than the developing lab. But the impulse that Eastman identified and served, the human desire to stop time, to hold the moment, to look back at where you have been and who was there with you, this impulse did not go away when Kodak went away. It never will. It is one of the deepest things about us. The night's end, what Kodak was. It is late now, and I want to end not with a lesson or a verdict, but with a feeling, the feeling of what Kodak actually was at its best before the end. Kodak was the company that made it possible for a family in the middle of the 20th century, any family, not a wealthy family or a sophisticated family, but an ordinary family in an ordinary town, to hold in their hands a photograph of a person they loved, a grandmother, a child, a friend, to hold it and look at it and say, there is the person, there is the moment, we were here, this was real, we had this. The photograph as an object, the physical print in your hands, the specific weight and texture of a 4x6 print, the slight gloss of the surface, the way the colors look in certain lights. This is what Kodak made. It is not nothing. It is not a small thing. It is one of the ways that human beings have managed the impossible fact of time, the fact that the people we love are temporary, that moments pass, that everything is always already becoming the past. The photograph says, not entirely, not completely, something remains. Kodak made those photographs for 100 years, for billions of people, in more countries than its founders ever visited. It made the moments lasting, or as lasting as paper and chemistry could make them. That is a remarkable thing to have done. The failure at the end is real, and the lessons are real, and the human cost was real, and none of that changes what was accomplished in the years before the end. The photographs are still there in the boxes, in the albums, in the shoeboxes under the beds. Yellowing, yes, fading eventually, but still there, still holding the moment, still saying we were here, this was real, we had this. That is what Kodak was for, and for a long time, it did it very well. Sleep well. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight.